Hello. So, when we think about this concept of inner growth and contrast that with what I'm referring to as worldly growth, I believe that on a fairly superficial level, these distinctions are fairly easy to see. For example, if I were to say that my goal is to grow my financial portfolio or to gain a lot of muscle or to lose weight, or to grow in my comedic abilities, or whatever, right? I think people naturally say these are clearly worldly, these are worldly goals, and they involve worldly growth. On the other hand, if I were to say something like, I want to grow in my patience, or the kindness within my mind and heart, or care for others, and so on. I think most of us would agree that that's an inner growth issue. But I think if we look just a little bit beyond the surface, we find I don't think it's so simple as just, oh, this is worldly, this is inner growth, spiritual growth, whatever. I'll give a couple examples. For example, if I say I want to be less angry. Suppose I have some anger, and I want to be less angry. So on one hand, it sounds like it involves inner growth, but maybe uh, if one were to look deep into my motivation, one would find that. So for example, it could be when I say I want to have less anger, it's that I want to change my inner terrain so that it's less perturbed by negative emotions. And so I would say that's a very inner orientation. But on the other hand, it could be that I want to be less angry, so that I want to have less anger so that I get along with people. So that if I get along with people, I have a better chance of getting a promotion, or I have a better chance of, finding a romantic partner, or something like that, which is, to me, I would say, is oriented more toward worldly concerns, yeah? Financial gain, romantic gain, in other words, an external focus. So the same goal can be informed by a different type of growth. And I think what underlies it is the orientation. Another word for orientation could be motivation. So we could have a motivation that's in some ways pure or more inwardly oriented, or we could have a motivation that's more about gain, like what can I get from others, or what can I get in this world. So one can use the word motivation or orientation to really describe the so-called goal. I think I mentioned in a previous video that I was learning to play a little piano. So I could take the stated goal of I'm learning to play piano better, become a better musician, right? But if let's suppose my motivation is I just want to use it as a period to show up and to sharpen my listening abilities and to uh, have deeper appreciation for music and a deeper appreciation for life and have some level of self-discipline, I would say that that shows quite a bit of an inner orientation or a motivation that's more spiritual in nature. On the other hand, if my motivation is more like, well, I want to play these pieces so I can impress people, or I can go to some open mic and just blow people's socks off, or I don't know, or just so I can start a band and write some songs and get famous, or whatever it may be. So I would say that's a very strongly worldly or externally focused orientation. So when we talk about inner growth and worldly growth, the way that I see it is that it's our motivation, it's our orientation. In what way are we oriented that really shapes whether we would call it spiritual growth or inner growth? And so one might pose the question of what would be a good, useful, operational definition for inner growth? And so I have one. And but before I offer it, I thought of something. So uh, I'm going to cite some things from the Christian tradition. And again, I want to make a disclaimer that I'm not Christian. I'm not really into that at all. But I think there are some things from that stream of teachings that are occasionally interesting. And so there's an image in I believe the Old Testament where Moses parts the Red Sea. I think that's an interesting image. And in the New Testament, there's a teaching, and I may be misquoting, but it's the teaching by Jesus about the mustard seed. And again, I may be mistaking this for something else, but I believe the teaching is something like, if you have the faith of even a mustard seed, a very tiny bit of faith, you can then go tell a mountain to move, and the mountain will move. Which, on a literal level is a ridiculous statement. So it's obviously not a literal teaching. And just coming up to an ocean and saying part and having the oceans part like in the movie, again, is ridiculous. It's against the laws of physics. But I think that there's a metaphorical teaching in both of these images. You tell an ocean to part, the ocean parts. You tell a mountain to move, and the mountain moves. Now, if I were friends with Jesus, like if Jesus were to come back, or I could, dream and I would meet Jesus, I would say, Jesus, I think if I were you, I would change the language. I wouldn't say you would tell a mountain to move. I think the language that's better is you would tell a mountain to cease to exist, and the mountain would cease to exist. He might be like, you're too intellectual sounding. I like sounding simpler. In the olden days, we didn't use such academic sounding words. We just said move, and then the mountain moves. And I would say to him, well, the language, that kind of language is very misleading. You get a bunch of people who literally think you can shout at a mountain to move, and the mountain will move. So anyway, so those two images, I want to come back to them, or I might go directly to them, is I think they tell us something about a good definition for an inner orientation or spiritual orientation, spiritual growth, spiritual goals. And this is how I would define a spiritual orientation or spiritual motivation or spiritual growth. And it's a pursuit that has no obstacles. Yeah. It's an endeavor without obstacles. There is no mountain when one is pointed spiritually. On the other hand, I would say that in contrast, a worldly orientation is an orientation full of mountains, full of a Red Sea that refuses to part. Whereas a spiritual orientation, it's not that the Red Sea parts, it's that the parting of the Red Sea is the natural state. So to use that metaphor, I might, and to mix it with a definition, I would say that if one wants to see the Red Sea part, one has to occupy a worldly orientation and move toward a spiritual orientation, and the sea will seemingly part. But again, going back to my sort of fantasy conversation with Jesus, I think a better way to describe it is that the sea that appeared to be, one realizes, never was. There was no sea as an obstacle. It was just open to begin with. Or if there was a sea, it was more a river going down, flowing downward, and one is sitting on a raft. So that the seeming obstacle is actually a vehicle to take us to where we want to go. And so that's the definition in my book, at least in this video, of what spiritual growth or spiritual orientation is. It's an orientation of no obstacles. It's an orientation that one could say causes obstacles to not exist, to not be. And one could say that instead, everything is a friend, or everything is a support, everything is an ally, everything becomes fuel, it becomes fodder for the journey.